Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP28 in Dubai. Ambitious, just together.
And with that, a warm welcome goes out to you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back in the German Pavilion here at COP28 in Dubai. For all the people and audiences joining us online, a warm welcome, and of course also a warm welcome, a very warm welcome here in Dubai to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, joining us here at the German Pavilion. It's great to see you. Thanks for joining us and starting into our day together with last night, with a very interesting, of course, start into the COP to remember when we talk about the Loss and Damage Fund that got pledged with a lot of information, but also, of course, with a lot of funds. And we talk about that also in a second. Reaching climate goals also requires, we need to talk about the emission verification, and that also brings in the question for commitment to transparency, and that's why we're here now, and that's our topic of the next hour. We zoom in a bit closer now with experts from that field in the next hour, so it's going to be about emission inventory, Earth observation, and modeling communities. When we elaborate also on decision-making to-dos, that's also something that we'd like to hear more about it. So transparency has a big meaning, it is a big keyword, and that's also something that keeps us busy as it requires commitment, and that's why we also will focus on the integrated greenhouse gas monitoring system for Germany, in short ITMS, just to give you some of the keywords already ahead. Showcasing how collaborative efforts of emission inventory experts, Earth observation scientists, and modeling communities are much, much needed. So our questions of today will be tackling how can we verify emissions and emission reductions with observations. That's just one question. Another question would be, what's the added value then of greenhouse gas monitoring systems for the inventories? And of course, when we look ahead, what is the way forward and which challenges lie ahead of us? So I brought some questions, but I hope you brought some questions as well. Also the question to the audience, feel invited to ask your questions along, and also, of course, ladies and gentlemen, in the internet and the live stream, there is the Slido tool for you, and you will see the QR code and the question box now, so please feel free to ask your questions to the panelists again. So I'd like to make a quick introduction before we start into our conversation. With us today is Dr. Christoph Gerbig. He's joining us online, and I hope you can hear as well. You're the head of airborne trace gas measurements and mesoscale modeling at the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry. And you're also leading the BMBF, which stands for the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, funded German research project Integriertes Treibhausgas Monitoring System für Deutschland, which is ITMS in short, drawing on a vast experience. So thank you very much, Christoph, for joining us today here in COP28.
Yeah, thank you, and welcome from Germany here.
Thank you. Also with us, merci, and bienvenue to Dr. Jean-Noël Thibault. Thank you for joining us. You're the director at the Copernicus Services at European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts. Thank you also for bringing your perspective to the panel. Thank you, merci. And we do have next to me Dr. Tobias Vosen from the Umweltbundesamt, in short the UBA, which creates the yearly national inventory report for the German greenhouse gas inventory for submission under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol. And you also brought some facts and figures for us. Thank you for joining us. Great to have you here. And thank you for joining as well, Dr. Oksana Tarasova. You're joining us online. You're the Senior Scientific Officer at the World Meteorological Organization. You are the head of the Atmospheric Environment Research Division in Science and Innovation Department from 2014 to 2022, and you coordinated the activities of the Global Atmosphere Watch Program, and now you're working on the Infrastructure Department on the development of the global greenhouse gas monitoring infrastructure. We can see you, and I hope you can hear as well.
Yeah, I can hear very well.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining us. And we also have more on the panel. Dr. Werner Kutsch is with us. You're the Director General of the Integrated Carbon Observation System. Thank you as well for joining and for giving us an outlook on your perspective. And last but not least, of course, Dr. Andreas Becker. You serve as the Chief of the Climate Monitoring Department at the Deutsche Wetterdienst, DWD, and you have a 30 years long lasting activities touching subjects in mesoscale meteorology, air quality, inversion modeling, emergency response, just to name a few. Thank you also for joining.
Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you. Well, as you can see, we have a big round, so let's start right into it. We're going to start with the first bit of our hour when it comes to the capacity of ITMs and the similar systems. So the question really tackles what can we do and what can we not do with observations to verify emissions. And to start, I hand over now to Christoph Gerbig. You tell us more about the national capacity of ITMS.
Yes, I'd be happy to show more. Now, I do not see any screen at the moment. I don't know if the presentation is actually available.
Can you see us, Christoph?
No, I cannot see you. I can see Oksana and myself in the screen. Ah, that is better. So now I see the slides as well. So, yeah, sorry for the glitch. I didn't know what.
No worries. The floor is yours.
What's happening? Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, so it's really an honor for me to present the ITMS at the German Pavilion during the COP28. So ITMS research project funded by the Science Ministry of Germany, and the co-authors that are listed here are those that have like coordinating roles within the project. But we have a large number of institutions from the German research landscape involved. Related to greenhouse gas research, as you can see on the list on the bottom of the screen of all those logos of institutions. If we move to the next slide, I want to give some key motivation as to why we are in need of reducing emissions. This is a very simple diagram from the last IPCC report showing the global warming as a function of emissions, simple correlation plot. And it shows a very clear near linear relationship with global warming increasing proportional to the cumulative emissions that have been occurred since the industrialization. And that holds for the past period. So I guess I cannot point at all up to the present, but also it holds for all the scenario simulations using various shared socioeconomic pathways up to 2100. So that very clearly says if we want to reduce global warming, there's nothing that we can do other than reducing greenhouse gas emissions or removing those from the atmosphere, whichever you prefer. Now, if we go to the next slide, so what does matter is what is in the atmosphere. And we have already a relatively good understanding what is in the atmosphere from emissions at the surface. This is shown here with a realistic simulation at high resolution over Europe. So here we see impacts from emissions at the surface, impacts around 100 meters, so in the lower atmosphere, the air that we breathe. And what you see on the right is methane, on the left is CO2. And the signatures that are left in the atmosphere are from sources at the surface related to anthropogenic emissions, but also related to biosphere uptake and release, as you see on the left, with the breathing of the biosphere, photosynthesis and respiration that is depending on solar radiation. And this couples with atmospheric dynamics. You can see also some sort of breathing on the right in methane. And that is related to the dynamic mixing in the boundary layer in the atmosphere. So there's transport mixing advection going on. And that distributes those signatures in the atmosphere. So that also means, if you go to the next slide, that we can use this as an approach to actually monitor the greenhouse gases by looking at the atmosphere. So using various observational data streams, using aircraft observations, using ICOS, tall tower observations, using also measurements that are made close to the ground, directly over source regions or over cities, and then combine that with models such as you've seen before, atmospheric transport models, and combine these models also with inventory information. So that's the underlying flux estimates that we start off with, to improve on those estimates, to get spatially, temporally resolved information on emissions, improved information on emissions for different emission sectors, such as traffic or heating or industry. And if you go to the next slide, so the approach of ITMS is a modular one. Can you please change to the next slide? Thank you. Can you move on to one more slide? I think there's something missing. Okay, the main word is missing. There's atmospheric models and inverse methods actually at the center. That is the ITMS modeling part. So this combines the modeling capacities that we have at the Max Planck Institute and with those at the German Weather Service. On the left, you see ITMS observations, where we organize the observational data streams, but also we link to the European scale to provide lateral boundary information, so inflow of greenhouse gases from the global scale. And on the right, you can see the sources and sinks addressed in a module that is also involving inventory people from the UBA and other experts on modeling of processes, of emission processes. Can you please go to the next slide? So the objectives are to develop and set up, implement a system to characterize, quantify, and monitor Germany's greenhouse gas sources and sinks, and to support a national inventory report with scientific verification. And the characterization of sources and sinks addresses the identification of regional hotspots, quantification of diffuse sources, but also differentiation of anthropogenic and natural sources and sinks, as you've seen with the biosphere having very strong impact. And the idea is also to support the industry and policy on mitigation measures. So can we actually see how emissions are being reduced? And last slide. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, why do we think we need the integrated greenhouse gas monitoring system for Germany? This session is called Trust Through Transparency. And this trust requires that, this transparency requires that we have something to show. And that's what we actually are aiming at, to add independent information from scientific observations to fight against alternative facts and fight news. And I think the best chance we have in a democracy is to convince people with facts and with transparency. So the idea is to establish a capacity at the German Weather Service for an operational service and to develop observational and modeling capabilities going into the future. Of course, this brings together the relevant scientific communities from inventories, from atmospheric data assimilation, weather prediction, and process understanding of, let's say, sources and sinks of greenhouse gases. And with that, I would like to thank you. I hope I wasn't too much over time.
Thank you, Christoph. No, you were right on time. Thanks for joining us and for giving your insights into that. We come into the comprehension question in a second. Now we are having Jean-Noël Thibault also with us. And maybe you can tell us, because we just heard a lot about capacity building, what is the EU capacity bringing in that regard?
Thank you. So I have a few slides to show. Do I need to press the button to...
Let's see if it appears. Let's see if we can see the presentation. It's behind you already.
Is it? Nice.
But that is...
I can see them too. Okay. Very...
Yeah? So the floor is yours.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for inviting me. And as you may have seen, the original person who was supposed to give this presentation is Richard Engelen, who is unfortunately sick at home with COVID. So I'm stepping in at short notice. But I will try to do my best. I also apologize because I'm embarrassingly sweaty because I had to run to be on time in this session because of security. So yes, I think that my presentation fits very well with what my previous speaker talk. And I'm going to talk about greenhouse gas emission monitoring for Copernicus. So you will recognize a similar sort of setup as what was presented for ITMS, because in the end we inspire ourselves from what has been done already for a number of decades with numerical weather prediction. So we know that observations on their own, whether they are from the surface or from satellites, cannot do it all, because what we are after is really to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions. So we use all the observations possible with modeling, which is about all the knowledge that we have accumulated over the years, to generate a number of outputs and products, which are emission monitoring data, providing user support, and serving the policies. And this is what the CO2 MVS, which is the CO2 monitoring verification support capacity that we've been mandated by the European Commission to develop. We are already doing quite a bit in CAMS, the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service, already. So we have a number of boundary or external factors that we take into account, like the European climate law, the EU methane strategy, the Paris Agreement, and you name it. So we have a framework in which gives us the sort of the mandate to provide this type of information to our users. So what is the current offer provided by the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service? So we are already providing some emissions, activity-based and inventory-based. So we are benefiting from already what is done at national levels. We are providing also global forecasts of atmospheric CO2 and methane at reasonably high resolution. And on the catalog of the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service, we also provide annually updated flux inversions on a monthly basis for CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. Now, the value chain which we believe can work with ITMS, and actually I recognize the little plot on the bottom right from the previous presentation, and CAMS can really provide the boundary conditions which are necessary to fine-tune what is done at national level. So this is we have a value chain from global to European to national, and CAMS can play a role in providing this information that is needed at a much higher resolution with additional observations that may be available in Germany. But we also have to, we can also benefit from what is done at national level, because the additional observations are of relevance for validation, but also for feeding the global models. And as the previous talk mentioned, it's about putting together the scientific community to make progress in estimation of emissions. So the current products also contain a global net flux estimates, which are feeding also into national inventories and national reports. And Germany, from that point of view, is an exemplar which could be followed by other countries, where basically the information which is available at global and European level is used to inform the activities which are done at national level. And I think this is the last slide showing the sort of the roadmap towards the CO2 monitoring verification support capacity. So there have been a number of reports which have been already written in terms of requirements for a CO2 emission or a greenhouse gas emission support capacity. So Copernicus is playing a major role in this, and will be part of a bigger picture, which probably Oksana is going to mention, about the greenhouse gas watch from WMO. But based on the current Sentinels, so the Copernicus satellite data, and the next one, which is coming up in hopefully 2026, which is called CO2M, which is a dedicated CO2 mission, we are building a capacity, putting together in situ observations, satellite information from these sentinels, and modeling framework, including an inversion system to provide the products and to improve on the estimation of anthropogenic emissions. So it's a journey, but we already have an infrastructure which is starting to work, and with the addition of these new dedicated satellite observations, which will come in 2026, we think that we can make a significant contribution to the stocktake, which will take place in 2028. And I think this is the end of Richard's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jean-Noël Tepov, and also thank you for stepping in. Thank you. We start that first round of comprehension question. Are there any questions now already burning? I do have here the Slido open as well. So ladies and gentlemen from the live stream, if you have already any comprehension question, let us know. I don't see any here yet. Is there, hang on, I'll have a microphone for you, so the live stream will understand you as well. Tell us who you are and what's your concrete question.
Hello, and thank you for the presentations. I'm Andreas Gold from the Danish Ministry of Finance. And I was curious to know, can you please tell us more about how you use the data from your project in sort of verifying the inventories? Maybe more specific, is it sort of verifying the uncertainty estimates on the central estimates, or, yeah, could you please elaborate more on that?
It's switched on, yeah.
It works?
Yes,
yeah.
Ça va.
Okay. So the one tricky aspect when we use satellite observations, for example, is that satellite observations don't measure surface emissions. They only measure the concentrations in the atmosphere. That's why we need all this infrastructure to go back to the surface emissions. This is not enough. We need also in situ observations. So anything which is available, like we will probably hear from ICOS in a minute, is something that we integrate in the system, and then we put this in a big engine called data assimilation system to pin down the information on surface emissions, but also on the uncertainty of these emissions. So the more information we have from all over the network, the finer the accuracy can be. So in a nutshell, that's what we do. And as the previous speaker said, this can provide a sort of large-scale boundary condition for national activities to use as a background information where they can add value with higher resolution models, additional possibly observations at a very fine level, and so forth.
You just handed over. Christoph, would you like to add on something?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Exactly, that's what I would like to do. I just wanted to add one bit, which is the information that we retrieve through atmospheric observations and subsequent atmospheric simulations is not direct on the fluxes, as the previous speaker already mentioned, but there's atmospheric mixing and diffusion involved. So there's a fine balance of spatial and temporal scales at which this monitoring system that can provide information. So it's not trivial, but the good thing is the atmosphere sees what gets into the atmosphere. So the information isn't like on the larger scale, the information is not lost, but fine-scale information can get lost. One has to assess exactly the uncertainties at the various scales. And that's in a dialogue that is ongoing with mission inventory people, at which locations, the scales, is there information that can be useful.
Andreas, what would you like to add on that from your perspective?
Maybe first of all, to your question, I think the user perspective will be presented also in the next two presentations. So let's wait on that. So there might be some elaboration also provided there. And as we come to the resolution question, I think it's a very important one. I mean, every time when a sort of sniffing system is set up, of course it can also raise concerns. So it could be that the target resolution is to sniff at the stack of a production facility, and those people running it might be unhappy about that. So my question would be, is there a target resolution, and is it that fine, or what would be the fit-for-purpose target resolution?
I guess that is a question for me, and I would say it's on the order of 5, 10, 20 kilometers. It is not the local scale, because that's where it becomes really complex from atmospheric perspectives. There you have turbulent eddies, swirls in the atmosphere that are stochastic, and on that scale we cannot really target atmospheric retrieved fluxes from atmospheric observation. So it's going to be the mesoscale, so 5 to 20 kilometers spatial resolution at most.
Would you like to add on something? And then we come to the user perspective. Tobias first, and then Dr. Jean.
I just want to add a small point. When we come to verification, I think it depends on what you want to verify, and then you have to look which resolution is the best. And I think if you have a large point source like a power plant, then it might be different than if you have something like agriculture, which is widespread and works differently with the emissions.
Yeah, just quickly, perhaps. We cannot distinguish, or we have to put the resolution and accuracy together, because what does it mean, the resolution, if it's a very large uncertainty? So it's in a way, it's the dialogue with the users which will tell us and drive us what we need to do for the next 10 years and what type of accuracy and resolution we need to achieve to fulfill the needs. So it's a dynamic field, I would say, and we need to, well, I'm keen to listen to you in a minute.
I have one question from the audience, which talks about or asks about the data. So which additional data will help the most? How would you answer that question from what we've just heard and from the first two presentations? Which additional data will help most? Christoph?
Yes, I guess that's a question for me. I mean, I don't want to push out, a certain data stream but if I could, then it would be CO2M. So spaceborne missions that are upcoming. I hope they will come in time. However, without an accurate in situ network of observations, this will be not possible. So from space, you can remotely observe the atmosphere, but what you're seeing is amounts that correspond to columns, column mean. So the whole atmosphere, vertical structure is folded into one number. And so the vertical distribution is not really seen. And there is a lot of need for improving also the atmospheric modeling. And there it comes to vertical information, and that's aircraft observations, and we don't have enough of those. But also long-term monitoring is important in order to give a long-term background. The long-term monitoring at the surface ensures consistency across decades, and that's something we cannot easily get through satellite because those don't live forever. And a calibration system in place with in situ that can live forever if we take care of it. I guess that's something that also Oksana will mention.
No, we're coming to that in a second. Oksana, we don't let you out. We're coming to you also in a second when we talk about the user perspective. I just want to add one more question from the live audience. So thanks, ladies and gentlemen, joining us in our live stream for sending your questions along. There's one more question. Are the European and the German observation networks sufficiently large to verify concentrations from modeling efforts? So again, are the European and the German observation networks sufficiently big enough, large enough to verify concentrations from modeling efforts? Who wants to join? Also Christoph and then Jean-Noël.
Yeah,
so we start with Christoph and then we go back to you, Jean-Noël.
Oh, sorry. I didn't really see that.
No worries.
Okay. I would say we're not really into verifying atmospheric concentrations. We're observing those, and then we're using that information in atmospheric simulations in a data assimilation mode. So we adjust the atmospheric simulation by adjusting underlying fluxes, and that way we get to an agreement between the observed and the simulated concentration. So the question is more like, is it dense enough to constrain all those fluxes? And there I would say, well, there's no limit to that density, but what is enough is, again, also a question of, well, how far do we want to go? And that is, as we had earlier, a question of communicating with the user. So with emission inventory people, with policy people, what kind of verification of emission reduction do you need at what scales? So that there is no clear answer from my side.
Yeah. Jean-Noël, what are your takeaways from that?
Yeah,
and then
I have very little to add to what has been said. I mean, we are beyond verification. We are actually assimilating these observations of atmospheric concentrations already. And we use this with modeling. And the real challenge is to go back to the fluxes and the emissions. And as Christoph said, we will never have enough in a way, but what is very important is to know what is required to support the inventories, to support the reporting, so that we can try to achieve this goal. Mm-hmm. And for this, we probably need more observations and probably more in situ observations. Maybe the other challenge is that the observations currently are not located where the needs are, but where the money is in a way. So we have quite a dense network in Europe, and we have nothing in Africa or wherever. So that's another challenge, but that's probably more on the turf of Oksana to discuss this.
Yes. A last bit from you, Bernard.
I can take this up because I'm responsible for organizing these observations in the atmosphere. If you look on a global map, the densest network is in Europe. So I think that's important to say. If I had money to invest, I would perhaps not invested in Europe, with one exemption, that's Eastern Europe. There we still have observational gaps, but we have much, much bigger gaps in other regions of the world, in Africa and South America, for example, and I think that's something we should also talk about. But yeah, as was already said, in principle there is no limit in the density of the observation. We are trying, for example, at the moment also observations on specific cities, which is a different approach, but it's also very interesting because the emissions at city level are much easier and perhaps even more important to monitor than having a monitoring network on or a denser background monitoring network on the European continent.
When we take the question about how we go into different geographies a little bit later into the take, Andreas, a little add-on and then we continue.
Very
with
short.
the next. Very short.
Oksana can understand it. Let me just stress, there's the first letter of the ITMS is I, and it's talking about integration. So the strength of the whole system and the approach is that it's able and capable to integrate various kinds of information, also from different observation types. So the area giving observation time of the remote sensing observations, with satellite as a top platform, but also the in situ information. So as we heard already, you never get enough, but that's a good sign because the system will always be capable to integrate any kind of information. First of all, we talk about the national scale, but also later we can upscale the whole thing. And now I stop because we might repeat and reiterate on that later on.
Absolutely. So let's dive into the user's perspective. What's the use? And with us is Tobias Fosen, as I've already mentioned. What is needed by inventory compilers? The stage and floor is all yours. Tobias.
Thank you. Can I get my...
Yes, it's behind you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Can you put the next slide? The remote is not working. Yeah, thank you. Please don't try to read that. That's our only pictures from agreements. I want to start to talk about a little bit why do we need transparency? Why is this important? And I think this is especially important here at this place. We are here at the climate negotiations, and we are here to get an agreement to lower the greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible, or maybe even stop them. And to form this an agreement, we need to have transparency about which country is doing what, and we need to get trust that we also can observe what other countries are doing. And that's why I think transparency is so important, and I'm not the only one who thinks that, because it's been part of the convention, it has been part of the Kyoto Protocol, and also in the Paris Agreement and all these major agreements, there have been parts who are saying we need greenhouse gas inventories. And now it works. To give you an impression how an inventory looks like, the emissions are divided into different sectors. The 5 main sectors are energy, which is actually includes everything where there's a combustion, where things are burned. Then we have industry without the combustion part. Then we have agriculture, land use change, and forestry, and waste. These are the major categories, and they are subdivided into more categories. Here's a part of the industry sector, so it starts with A and it goes, I think, till H, and then it's even more divided. Then you have silicon carbide, so how much emissions are coming from the production of silicon carbide, or Gluaxakal, or however this is pronounced. So it's, our whole inventory is like a long list with different sectors and the corresponding emissions. And since I will use the words, I will also explain how we estimate the emissions. We always have the activity data and the emissions factor, and they're multiplied, and the result is the emission. So the activity data can be something like amount of coal burned, or number of cows, and yeah, things like that. And the emission factor is like the emission from 1 ton of coal burned, or from 1 cow over a year, and things like that. But actually, I'm not sure if we use cow as a activity data. It might also be like milk production or things like that. So, how we need, how we can use Earth observation. Yeah, we already talked about verification, and yeah, that's the major point. I mean, we generate the data. Usually we don't use Earth observation data, but data from statistical offices, or directly from companies, or data that is available, but or from taxes, things like that. And then we estimate the emissions, but then we have a result. But for us, it's an interesting question. Well, are we going in the right direction? Are we missing something? Do we over or underestimate the emissions? And for this, I think Earth observation can be very helpful. Here's an example about with the German map and the methane emissions. Well, there the grid is very large. Well, you can see that the methane emissions go down, but from this alone, it would probably be very difficult to determine whether the emissions come from the industry or cars or things like that. So for inventories, it would only help a little bit. I think these are CAMS data, maybe. Here I want to show you a project a colleague of me did in his master thesis. Used Sentinel-5P data, which measures methane. And then with some modeling and weather data, he could get this graphic here. And this is from a waste disposal site, and which emit methane. And so you could get a quite nice figure. And well, this could potentially help us to see, oh, okay, well, with this graph, probably the emissions need to be that and that high, and then we can look what are our estimates for the emissions, and then, well, we can see how that fits together. Here's a different graph comparing the totals from our emissions with other inventories, let me call it. So here, for example, we compare our inventory data with the CAMS data, and you can see that the trend is very similar. Well, here's a gap, so maybe they're missing something, or we are overestimating something. So for CO2, that's in this part, it works very fine. For methane, it's, well, not that good, but still it's going in the same direction. But here for N2O emissions, you can see it's very different. So they're well, it's not that useful yet. Here I want to show you an example which we did very recently. Well, I'm not sure you, I will tell you because you cannot see very much here. We also do, this is not related to greenhouse gas emissions, but to air pollutants. We also do inventories for air pollutants. And a major air pollutant is dust, particulate matter, and a major source is open mines, which for sand and rocks and things like that. And as you can all imagine, if it's dry and windy, there's a lot of dust, and if it's wet and there's no wind, then all the dust stays on the ground, and it's fine. So here we used ERA 5 wind data to improve our models for the estimations. To include the weather in a better way and more precise way, and thereby improving then our inventory. And I think, that's it.
Thank you, Tobias. All right, thank you very much. Oksana, now it's up to you. So you also brought us, of course, a lot of facts and figures, a lot of information when it comes to the global scale. And we dive right into your presentation, I would say. I hope you can still see us and you can hear us well.
Yeah.
It's great to have you here on the panel, so the stage is yours.
Thank you. Can we have a slide on the screen, please?
Like that? Can you see us now with the presentation?
Yeah, I can see you with the presentation. Okay, excellent. So I will actually discuss how we can reuse the observation in support of the climate mitigation. And if we can go to the first slide. First of all, we need to understand what information is required when you go to the mitigation. And we know that the basic for the mitigation is the emission estimates on the common baseline. But also we would like to have the very nice geographical and sectoral distribution of emissions, because any person who is doing mitigation would like to know where to decrease emissions or which specific sector. We also would like to understand what is the expected response in atmospheric concentrations, which is happening in response to mitigation action, because it's at the end of the day, the concentration in the atmosphere which drives the climate change. But also, when we plan the mitigation actions in the future, we would like to know how the concentrations will change, because many of those do respond to the climate change as well. So we would like to have a consistent information which is provided on routine and sustained basis, because you cannot have information today and no information tomorrow. But also we would like to have this information which is tailored to the individual decision-making scale or the decision maker purposes. Next slide, please. So where we are at this current point is that on the global scale, we do have information about atmospheric concentrations. We have the Global Atmosphere Watch Program, which was established in 1989, which coordinates the global observations of concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And we make those data openly available, so there is a full transparency on what we are doing with atmospheric measurements. But as you can see on the map, though we can see and understand the global changes, there are substantial gaps in observing network. And as you can see with the dots, the densest observational network is indeed in Europe, but the majority of the world on the land, including the large territories of Eurasia, in Africa, in Latin America, they are very poorly observed, not talking about the ocean observation, which are extremely sparse. And based on those observations, we can calculate the global average. And that is done with a very, very small uncertainty. It's a very robust number. And you can see it on the plot, which is a current kind of an orange line, which also puts the emissions and emission change in CO2. And as you can see that actually in the global average, we do not see a very fast response on such substantial changes in emission as, for example, economic crisis or COVID. The global average is not sensitive to the emission changes which we need to observe. So if we wanted to have information available for the decision making, we need actually to build something which is much more robust and much more dense and much more tailored to the decision making scale, rather than having the global average and a global network. So we need to move to something which is higher resolution and more operational. Next slide, please. And for that, we are building the Global Greenhouse Gas Watch, which will be using as much observations as possible from aircraft, satellite, ground-based, combined with an additional information. We call it the prior information, which are the fluxes, which we know anthropogenic fluxes and natural fluxes, and combine them in the modeling system, just as Christoph explained, and produce monthly net fluxes of CO2 and methane with a resolution of 1 by 1 degree, as well as the three-dimensional flows. And those will be produced by the several big centers, including Copernicus. There is a center which is being built in US. There is a center which is being built in Japan. So we will bring the consensus information from all those centers, which will give us much more information for the decision making. Next slide, please. But when we talk about the decision making and when we talk about the users, we need to distinguish two categories of user. There are end users and those who will be using this information, for example, for the compilation of emission inventory, or for taking decisions on a national scale, or for taking decisions at a much smaller scale, for example, urban scale, facility scale. So we need to convert those global estimates into the harmonized and standardized user-tailored products on those scales where the users do see it. And from the global product, we can do aggregation of this global product by the region, but we also can do the disaggregation of those global products into the sectoral application, into the distinguishing between anthropogenic and non-anthropogenic, like natural sources, but also looking at what is coming up from the biomass burning, ocean, and etc. And we need to do it in a way so that those products which we create across the post-processing value chain are actually consistent. So if one post-processing is done and you get the product which is applicable for the urban scale, you want to know that the similar post-processing is applied in a different place, so you can actually compare the estimates together. Next slide, please. And for that purpose, we established a system which is called Integrated Global Greenhouse Gas Information System that is used as a common framework for production of the systematic services to the user community, with intention to help understand and improve emission and update estimate on the scales which are coming from industrial scales to city scale to country scale, and at the end contributing to the global stock data. And for that, we developed the good practices. For example, we produced the good practices document on the evaluation of the urban emission using atmospheric observation. Next slide, please. And this methodology has been already recognized in the policy process. For example, the SAPSTE session in 2019 recognized IGES as an innovative science-based framework that supports the needs of the broader range of user community, and it also encouraged to use this framework. This framework is also put up in the updated emission inventory guidebook, which was produced in 2019 in the chapter 6, which is talking about quality assurance and quality control. And as I explained you, the advantage, or let's say the additional value of this observational-based systems is that the solution is scalable. You can go and set up your measurement system and your modeling system so you can go on the scales consistently from the very small scale to the national scale. Next slide, please. And here's a couple of demonstrations. Such system has been implemented already in UK and Switzerland. And if we look at the comparison at the national scale of emission estimate produced by UK, you can see that the blue line, which is observational-based estimate, is slightly higher than the emission inventory. And there is a communication between the atmospheric community and inventory community in UK to understand where does this difference come from. But also, based on atmospheric observation, as demonstrated in the case of methane in Switzerland, you can get much better granularity of the information, because emissions do have the seasonal cycle, and unlike national reporting, which is done on the basis of annual averages, you can see much more granularity and tailor your actions for the specific economic activity which produce emissions when you have the peak of those emissions. Next slide, please. And there is even more value if you try to use the observational-based technique to look at the land use land cover sector. Because land use land cover sector does respond to meteorological and climatological conditions. And as we can see, the evaluation of the land use land cover sector for New Zealand shows in green bars that the uptake of the forest of CO2 in New Zealand is much larger than the grey bars, which is the estimate from the inventory. And this is a good thing, because if you go into the area, for example, of carbon trading, you would like to understand that if you buy a particular part of the forest and you wanted to do the offsetting with those parts of the forest, of the emissions which are happening in a particular industry or in a particular country, you would like to understand what is a reality check on the uptakes of those forests. But as I said, you can go even to the smaller scale, and you can see here the example of the assessment of the landfills in the Great Toronto Area, with several measurement techniques, not just one particular in situ measurement, but also remote sensing, and the mapping with the different gas analyzers on the ground has been taking place. You can see in the different colors of the bars the range of emissions which has been measured around different landfills in Toronto. And with a star, you can see the traditional inventory approach. And you can see that you can either underestimate or overestimate the emissions which are coming from the landfills, because they're also responding to changing climate or the changing environment around those landfills, and that in some cases the peak emissions are much higher than what you see in inventory. So there is a lot of additional information which can be created with observational-based techniques on different scales, and you can produce this information, and WMO develops the common good practices for such solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oksana Tarasova. Thank you for your insights. Are there any comprehension questions now for the past two presentations? If so, let us know. I do check the live stream as well. So if there's anything that keeps you busy in your mind, let us know. Otherwise, I would start with a first round of questions. When it comes to geographies, and we've already tackled it a bit earlier about how to support on the same level in different geographical locations and different geographies. How do we do it, and what's on the to-do list so far to really make it possible that inventories that are now needed by a lot of nations, also by the Global South, and you know, how do we learn from each other? Werner Kutsch, could you give us an insight, because you're also an expert on observation infrastructure. What's your take on that, to really fill the blind gaps?
Well, let me perhaps first give one other statement. I think you have learned we have two different systems. We have the official inventory system, we have the NDCs, and the countries and our wise leaders are next door, have promised to reduce the emissions, the fossil fuel emissions. And this is one system that is in itself consistent, but the truth in the end is in the atmosphere. The truth is in the atmosphere, so we have to look at the atmosphere, and looking at the atmosphere in principle means that we have an independent system, a second system that looks from a different angle at the same information. And I think the first challenge that we have is to bring these two systems better together. So we need to bring these systems together, and I think we have to learn the language of the other system. We have to learn what is the other system reporting or measuring, and then I think we can get a true additional information stream that we can put into the reporting. But this is a lot of work still to do. Again, the truth is in the atmosphere. A second information that we need is, it's not only about fossil fuel emissions. We are quite clear from the scientific side that we have to phase out all fossil fuel emissions, including gas, including oil. But we have also the natural fluxes, the uptake of oceans, the uptake of forests, the release of carbon dioxide from land when it's burning, for example. And this is also the truth in the atmosphere, and this is another information that we have to bring together. So the simplest global stocktake would be just looking at the atmosphere and looking how all this information is coming together. And for this, we need definitely more dense observational networks beyond Europe. So I think we have a lot of information in Germany, in Europe, but it was shown several times on the maps recently by Oksana. We have almost nothing in Africa, nothing in South America, nothing in Central Eurasia, and these are gaps that we should really fill together. So that's the motto, the last point of the motto of the German Pavilion. So helping, for example, African countries to build up the respective science, to build up the respective observational capacity, I think it's a very important challenge that we also should face and quickly fix.
Absolutely. Andreas, would you have a comment on that? Or I quickly go to Oksana. Otherwise, Oksana, you've mentioned it as well. You've shown us the maps. So tell us a little bit in a nutshell, what's the homework, what's the top priority to build up these networks? Because we are here on COP and everything needs to pin down on short sentences and quick notes, what should be written on our post-it to really go forward. And, within the motto and the theme of the German Climate Pavilion, ambitious, just, but also together.
Yeah, I will echo what Werner just said. We need to understand what happens with the global system. So the emissions of fossil fuels definitely need to decrease. But what is happening, for example, is that first of all, the lack of observing system does not allow us to understand what is happening on the global scale and what is happening. For example, with methane, last year we observed one of the largest increases in global methane concentration on a global scale, and we don't know what is happening. Like there is a response to El Niño, there is a response to La Niña, and those processes, or there is a climate feedback, and those processes in the future can completely change how we need to do mitigation. For example, if what we observed in Europe in 2022, there was a drought in summer, and this drought in summer reduced the uptake of CO2 by the terrestrial biosphere by 60 gigatons CO2. I mean, who will do that? Mm-hmm. This means that this amount of CO2 stays in the atmosphere, and that should impact the emissions, the emission mitigation which we are doing related to fossil fuel. And majority of the uptakes which are happening in tropical forests, or emissions which are happening in tropical forests, are completely not understood. We don't know what is happening there. And as we move to the hotter and hotter climate, the climate feedbacks will kick off. And to be smart and to do the smart mitigation, we need to fill the gaps in the tropical regions where those will happen in a tropical forest. And we heard a lot that there's a lot of plans to actually do the carbon offsetting using the tropical forest. Yeah, but actually, do you know what actually the forest is doing there? Because there's no measurement system there. The same as about the polar regions, where you have the melting of the permafrost. The polar regions are not observed. Oceans are taking up 25%, and we observe only 3% of the ocean. That is the point which needs to be addressed pretty urgently. If we don't want to lock ourselves in the climate system, which is changing in a non-understandable way, we need to address those gaps as soon as possible.
Christoph, I saw your hand sign. Come in, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, just to also respond to Oksana's comment and also to Werner Kutsch's comment on there are, natural systems. There's also feedback of the changing climate on natural systems. That also, yes, the atmosphere doesn't lie. The truth is in the atmosphere, but there is a lot of, I would say, noise on timescales less than climate timescales. So less than 30-year periods when we talk about climate, but that are related to interannual changes in weather and in El Niño and such things. And those lead to those droughts. And of course, it is, in terms of mitigation, the question is the longer time scales. that need to be understood in terms of the feedback. Of course, those also involve the short timescales, but it does require observing those systems, so I can only support this. And I mean, we are from Max Planck, with help from funding from BMBF, working in central Amazon with the Atto Observatory, also in central Siberia and in northern Siberia with observatories, which were trying to. Of course, there's also funding from the respective national research agencies involved. We're trying to bring these into the global atmospheric watch network, but that requires all the, traceability, to have the referenceable measurements. But we're working on that. And there are, of course, a lot more needed to understand those long-term feedback processes. And yes, the truth is in the atmosphere.
Andreas, and then we come to your questions from the live audience.
Yes, let me just a little bit summarize the statements before. I think it's very important that we see here, on the one hand, as there was a question, is it fit for the purpose? Yes, on the national scale, we are quite convinced that it's fit for the purpose of hardening the numbers on the emission inventories. But if we upscale it, then we see all the gaps. And I think Oksana and Werner have mentioned that in a pretty convincing way. So we see gaps, of course, because of the very heterogeneous topology in the monitoring. But actually, as a weather service, a Deutscher Wetterdienst, or as a Copernicus service, this is our bread and butter job. We know exactly, we have to deal with that anyway, also in our daily business. And a method we utilize, and that is also a method utilized in ITMS, is a kind of data assimilation. So, and the data assimilation on the one hand has one strength, it can really take best benefit from any kind of observation. And then the second, that's probably more important here in this context, it can also tell where it is most efficient to add observations. And I think that is what has mentioned in different contexts. Christoph, you also, for more in-depth scientific open questions, that is really a strength of ITMS or ITMS kind of approaches that we want to show here to the audience and to the community and provide it to the community.
But if we have an outlook, so where are we heading and how can we maintain the system sustainably?
Maybe, Jean-Noël, you want to answer that? Company?
It was more to complement what you said. There are gaps, and we need to be the advocates of adding observations where they are missing. But we shouldn't. I mean, we should manage our expectations. I can't see that in 10 years' time Africa will be fully covered because we are saying that it should be covered. So investing in exploiting even more what is from the sky, from satellites, combining it with in situ, complementing it with modeling information, so through data assimilation is really something which we need to promote and to work on, because in the decades to come, the only sort of global observations that we will have at our disposal will come from satellites. So the more in situ observations, and maybe engaging the private sector, perhaps the G3W will promote this, the better. But I think that we should really invest also in trying to exploit to the maximum what we know we will have at our disposal.
Werner, when we head into the last 20 minutes now of our conversation, time flies. So what do we need to take away from that panel? Also, being in this ecosystem of COP28 going forward, what's important to remember?
Well, one thing is important to state. ICOS is an observational network that has been developed over the last 15 years. ITMS is building on top of this. And I think if we see it a little bit as an example, as a feasibility study, I think we can be proud in Europe what we already have, and also in Germany, because we have a dense network of measurements. We can see differences between the different observational towers, which gives us a subtle regional information, and we can develop this. And I think it's always good that you have in one or two places in the world systems that are in a way proving that we can get this additional information stream from the atmosphere that is supplementing the official inventories. So ICOS is covering 16 countries, including Germany, and we have something like 500 scientists working on this, working on the observations, but also on the use of the data. And I think it's good to have this example. And it's good to share this example. And that's, I think, really important. We will have a side event next week on empowering African countries to get things like that. We have a small EU project on this. It's 6th of December, and I think that's the challenge that we really have in front of us, that we better share our experiences, and that we really bring good use of these experiences, of these good experiences we have into the whole COP system. And yeah, well, we are happy to do this from the ICO side, and I know that Copernicus is also doing this. And I think empowering many countries in bringing additional atmospheric information into their national processes, I think that's something that is urgently necessary.
Andreas, before we speak about trust and transparency again, coming back to the title, I'd like to introduce you again, ladies and gentlemen. If you have any questions, give me a hand sign and the microphone is all yours. Otherwise, I go on with the live stream questions for a second. So there are several questions and I just popped them out. How many countries do inventories at all, and how many countries do observation-based emission verification? Are there any numbers? Oksana, Christoph, I look to you. Who wants to join? Oksana, yes. I see your hand. So how many countries do inventories at all, and how many countries do observation-based emission verification? Do you have any data for us?
Yeah, and this data will be not super impressive. So currently, the reporting using the traditional inventory, which is the bottom-up inventory, and atmospheric-based, which we call top-down, is officially reported by 5 countries. Those include UK, Switzerland, Australia for some HFCs, and New Zealand for land use, land cover, as well as last year there was a report on ASA6 by United States of America. So I think that Germany does not report those emissions, the top-down emissions yet, but they are building the system, as we heard. So they will be number 6. And there is also one system which is currently being built in South Korea. They are also doing the multi-scale system similar to what Germany is doing. And if we look at the number of member countries, particularly in WMO, we have 193 member countries. And there's, okay, let's say 7 which are doing it on a national scale or planning to do it. So it's not super impressive. Concerning the measurements, we know that within Global Atmosphere Watch Program, there is 100 countries who are doing the measurements of greenhouse gases. Concerning emission inventories, before the reporting, official reporting under Paris Agreement, because under Paris Agreement all countries have to have their national reporting, there was only the reporting from Annex 1 country. So that is not a lot of reporting countries around the world. But under Paris Agreement, it's now required from all the countries to report the inventory. And that will be a challenge, because then last time I actually checked the the reporting of non-Annex 1 countries. The latest update of inventory was 2018 by one of the countries in South America, and all the other inventories were much older than that. So we are taking decisions based on information which is absolutely outdated. And with our greenhouse gas watch, we try to help countries to get information which is much closer to the date, and we get pretty critical update on the decision-making information.
Thank you, Oksana. Well, another question from the live audience in the live stream is the following. For doing inversion of greenhouse gas fluxes in a regional scale, you need the correct boundary conditions for the concentrations outside of your regions of interest, so that your regional estimates are right. And therefore, the question comes, how big is the effect of the lack of observations, let's say in Latin America, into the German greenhouse gas flux estimations?
Maybe I take
yes,
that.
Christoph, and then Andreas. Yeah, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Yeah. So the large-scale influence is, of course, underlying under atmospheric mixing. So what, let's say, enters from the westerly regions of the Atlantic to the European continent is, let's say, highly mixed and diluted. So we're not that super sensitive to specific gaps in areas. If we have sufficient amount of remote sensing data, we expect that influence to be not too large. But of course, it's more of local interest to fill those gaps, I would say. In terms of observing for Germany or for Europe, we can get around that, I would even say. We have to take into account this uncertainty, but we can live with it, and it doesn't dominate our understanding or our uncertainty budget for greenhouse gas emission estimate.
Let me just one sentence add. This is a typical example or question where the synergy between Copernicus, the European scale, and the national scale is really helpful, because we get, of course, the transboundary imports also from the information raised in camps.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anything to add from the panel before we come to the next question?
Yeah, no, I was going to say that the value chain between global, European, and national, I think, is a very nice example, which is actually what is happening now with ITMS and the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service. So, and if this could be scaled to other countries, I think that would be really good.
Wonderful. I see one more question here in the audience. Thank you so much for being here today. Who are you and what's your question?
Thank you. I'm Mads Libbergren from the Danish Ministry of Finance. And just in case you're wondering why our Ministry of Finance is doing this stuff, these kinds of accounts are getting almost as important as our normal economic accounts. In Denmark, we have a very challenging target for emissions reductions. A lot of it is within agriculture and LULUCF, and what we're finding is that we are doing policy on very literally swampy ground. So first of all, huge thanks for Germany and for all of this fantastic information. Thanks to Oksana for showcasing what's going on out in the world. A very concrete question on, we heard from Oksana that New Zealanders were using observational data for LULUCF accounting. In the EU, we just revised the LULUCF regulation, which tasks member states to have much more detailed, granular inventory reporting. And my question is maybe to Tobias, is Germany using, or will you be using some of these data in terms of informing LULUCF inventories? And so a specific question there, how do you sort of balance what is anthropogenic and what is natural, and how to, you could say, get a better understanding of that? Because that seems rather difficult. Thanks.
Is it on? Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I cannot tell you how we're doing our LULUCF calculations. I'm not doing them, and yeah, therefore I cannot answer that. But I'm actually very curious about the second part of your questions about how to distinguish between anthropogenic and other emissions. I mean, for our inventories, it's clear, but I'm actually also was wondering how it's done with the Earth observation systems.
Let me just add on that.
And then
I think
yes, I see you.
Oksana You first.
Oh, you.
Ladies first.
No, hang on, Andreas. You go first, and then I'll see Oksana, and then we come back to Christoph.
Okay. First of all, big thank you, because that shows really the many other use cases of the systems, despite the one that we are just have imposed in the beginning when the ITMS project was designed. By the way, by Andrea Kaiser-Weiss, she was a co-brain with Christoph Gerbig on that issue. But we see exactly as you say, when we upscale it and I look at two other use cases, the sync question, how that works, is really a big and open question. And one strength of this system, and if weather centers and WMO do the job, there's a certain level of prudence and independence in the findings. And that's also a very important element, as we can just easily expect that these issues, which also are related to carbon trading, will raise many other players who have probably other interests than just the interests that we see here with COP. And so it's very important that from our side, this capacity is built up and maintained, so that it keeps also this prudence and independence, and that we have reliable and standardized information exchanged.
Oksana, I see you. The floor is yours now to give your one comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will just echo what my colleague said, that you can do with atmospheric observation, you can distinguish between, let's say, anthropogenic and biogenic emissions, because you can measure some additional proxies that allow you to distinguish between, let's say, CO2 which is coming from fossil fuel sector and CO2 which is coming from non-fossil fuel sector. How it's done in New Zealand, they are using observations of CO2. They're also using observations of radiocarbon. And radiocarbon allows them to say, okay, if there is no radiocarbon, this is a fossil fuel CO2. If there is radiocarbon in our measurements, then it's the biosphere related thing. But there are also some other priors which are being tested. For example, some additional measurements, we call it COS, which is a proxy to photosynthetic activity. So you can actually get the large scale constraints on the, let's say, not as detailed attribution as an emission inventory. We will never get to this granularity, but at least on the large groups of anthropogenic or biogenic, it is pretty critical that we can actually distinguish those using atmospheric observation. And this is what has been done in New Zealand. Echoing what Andreas said about carbon trading and emission offsetting, most of the carbon offsetting is done with the forestry projects, and those forestry projects are very poorly characterized. Just to give you an anecdotal information, there are carbon credits which are sold for Amazon basin. We have a group of Luciana Gatti, who is making measurements in Amazon using the aircraft observations, and she's doing vertical profile. And what she sees with observation is that southeastern part of Amazon is emitting CO2, despite the fact that there is a forest there, and those parts which are emitting are still being sold as carbon offsets. Well, I don't think that this is offsetting anything.
No, absolutely not. Christoph and then Werner. Christoph?
Yes, just to get back at this land use change and forestry issue. We in ITMS, we do plan to use the information also from the top down, so from the atmosphere, because the network that we currently have in place from ICOS is actually more targeted at biosphere-atmosphere exchange than at direct emissions from anthropogenic sources. So the network design is such that we do not have atmospheric towers in the centers of the cities or next to power plants, because it makes it difficult to use those data then in a mesoscale atmospheric assimilation system. So that's the decision to go a little bit away from those intense source things. So we have the ability to monitor very well biosphere-atmosphere exchange. And yes, we're targeting to combine that information or to confront that information with the reporting from inventory side. Now, the issue is that what the atmosphere actually sees is direct carbon fluxes exchanged between biosphere and atmosphere. Now, LULUCF accounting is different from that. We're interested in what carbon is actually stored in the ground and in the biomass. And there is a difference. If you have a harvest, you're transporting large fractions of the carbon away in so-called lateral fluxes. Also, when you have leaching of dissolved organic carbon or inorganic carbon through groundwater, that will also transport away carbon that the atmosphere doesn't see, but it is important when you want to compare those two different constraints. So there's still a lot of open research also on that front. And yes, we're targeting this to use the top-down also in Germany for that.
Mm-hmm. Werner, the last point. What's the take-home message from what you've just heard and when you echo all around here?
I might ask the technique for my Joker slide. If it's coming, I will be happy. But otherwise, I think it's important. We can see some subtle information also from the atmosphere about biospheric fluxes, and we might see additionality of specific measures. But it's not all. Science is providing a lot of additional data and information. So we have specific soil.
There it is.
So there's my slide. And I said the truth is in the atmosphere. These are about 30 atmospheric stations in Europe. And you can see the trend. It's going up, 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 up. But you see also this annual variation, which is coming from the photosynthesis in summer that is dropping down the CO2 concentration, and then in winter it's increasing again. And then you see differences between all the different locations. And this is subtle information about local fluxes. So sometimes it's going steeper down, sometimes it's going not so steep down, and so on and so on. And scientists, for example, in the ITMS system, they are analyzing exactly all the information that is in these differences between the concentration measurements. And there is also some information that might be important for the LULUCF sector, because we can see that a regional drop down is smaller because of a drought or because of a specific activity. And that's what we're hoping to develop further. And you see the density in Europe, so we have the information that we can analyze and where we can get perhaps much, much more out as we can get out at the moment. But this is the future of the integration between modeling, between these observations and satellite information, who bring on top of this even more detailed spatial information. So I think when it comes to finance, we can also provide information to specific projects. It's also important that finance looks as observations. I think investing in observations might also be a good investment into future knowledge that can be applied. So it's something that goes in both directions.
Thank you, Werner. Andreas, you've got the last word. So when we talk about trust, and I do see the big title here running around, trust through transparency, why did you decide to call it like that? Because trust through transparency, what does it have to do when we look and when we head out of our conversation here now?
Well, I think it's of course also related to where we are here in Dubai, as one of the big issues this year and at this COP is a global stocktake mechanism, and that requires sufficient transparency on what is going on, because what it all about with the global stocktake is that for the first time in the, let's say, in the treaty environment or the treaty development from 1992 in Rio through the Kyoto Protocol and then with the Paris Agreement, first of all we had a verification component coming in. Before there was no verification component in it, and believe it or not, or like it or not, but in international context, any kind of treaty without verification component is on troubled ground. So that is really now a very important extra step with the Paris Agreement, and the GST, the global stocktake, will implement this because that now in a regular in a regular manner we will always look what has happening. How did the mitigation work on? Was it successful? And this needs this transparency where also the ITMS and the related capacity that we have demonstrated today will make a crucial contribution. And that's why we also called this here not only trust through transparency, but also Germany's contribution into this context.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for bringing us together. This is your round of applause to Dr. Christoph Gerbeck, Dr. Jean-Noël Thibault, Dr. Tobias Voss, and yes, you can shower them in applause. Dr. Oksana Tarasova, thank you for joining. Dr. Werner Kutsch and Dr. Andreas Becker, thank you very much. And if you're interested, from Dubai to Brussels, we do have right away, in 4 hours, another event. It's called Our Shared Future, Climate Monitoring, Climate Adaptation, Climate Mitigation, and Cross-Sector Collaboration, working together in the EU to deliver the Green Deal and achieve the green transition. So it's at 11:30 a.m. Brussels time. So you can join online, right? And you will find the link on the event page where you just found us now on the German Climate Pavilion. Thank you all. Thank you for your question. Thank you for your time. And I'll see you later on for more conversations. Then we have a talk about climate crises from a feminist foreign policy perspective. It's going to be interesting. Thank you. Thank you for watching. See you soon.
Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP28 in Dubai. Ambitious, just together.